Close your eyes for a moment. Smell the incense burning in the stone halls. Feel the oppressive heat of Alexandria and hear the whispers of betrayal all around you. This isn't the Cleopatra you know from movies or legends. This is the woman struggling under the crushing weight of a kingdom crumbling at her feet. Let's step into her world. Imagine waking up knowing the people at your breakfast table might someday try to kill you. That sounds dramatic, but for Cleopatra, this was just family life. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for its bloodshed. Sure, they had their golden crowns and lavish temples, but their most consistent tradition was betrayal, and not the sneaky, behind-your-back kind. This was the poison your wine, stab you in the bath variety. Holding on to power wasn't just hard, it was downright dangerous. If you weren't smart or ruthless, you didn't survive. Cleopatra's family tree was more like a web, tangled and twisted in the worst possible ways. For decades, the Ptolemies followed a tradition of marrying their siblings to keep the bloodline pure. But keeping things in the family didn't exactly create harmony. Paranoia ran high. Brothers plotted against brothers, sisters turned on sisters, and even parents weren't immune to backstabbing their children. Her father, Ptolemy XII, famously nicknamed All-Eats, or the flute player, knew this chaos well. He wasn't exiled just once but twice during his reign, the second time by his own people, who'd had enough of his mismanagement and constant puppeteering by Rome. Cleopatra grew up watching this, her father desperately clinging to the throne, his rivals circling like vultures. She learned early that rulers didn't sit on their thrones comfortably. They clutched them with white knuckles. When Ptolemy XII died, things only got worse. Egypt didn't pass power neatly from one ruler to another. Instead, it was more like a fierce, never-ending game of musical chairs. Cleopatra, just a teenager at the time, became co-ruler with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But co-ruler is a generous way to describe it. The two weren't exactly playing nice. Cleopatra, already sharp for her age, wanted full control. Ptolemy XIII, on the other hand, wasn't about to let his older sister call the shots. They clashed almost immediately, and it became clear there wouldn't be room for both of them on the throne. Ptolemy XIII, still a boy, but surrounded by ambitious advisors eager to manipulate him, eventually forced Cleopatra out. She didn't just lose her position. She lost her home, her allies, and her safety all at once. Cleopatra fled Egypt, essentially becoming a fugitive. Picture that for a moment. A young woman, barely out of her teens, wandering through the deserts, trying to figure out how to win back her crown. Despite these circumstances, Cleopatra didn't panic. Instead, she bided her time, plotting her comeback with a patience that would become one of her defining traits. And it wasn't just her brother who made Cleopatra's upbringing a masterclass in survival. Even within her own household, trust was a luxury she could never afford. Alliances among siblings were temporary, at best. At worst, they were death traps. Cleopatra's parents and grandparents had already set the example. Sibling rivalry in this family wasn't resolved with a petty argument. It ended with one person disappearing forever. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy described the Ptolemaic family as exceptionally skilled at self-destruction. And it's hard to argue with that. Cleopatra wasn't only dealing with political enemies outside her palace walls. She was constantly glancing over her shoulder at the people sharing her roof. This environment forced Cleopatra to grow up fast. From an early age, she understood that her survival depended on cunning, not kindness. She had to think ahead, read people's intentions, and act decisively. It's probably no coincidence that she became one of the most shrewd political players in history. But none of this was easy. Imagine living in a state of constant vigilance, where your family gatherings felt more like battlefields than reunions. Cleopatra's ability to adapt may have been her greatest strength, and she developed it through sheer necessity. Take her father's exile, for instance. When Ptolemy XII was forced to flee Egypt, Cleopatra went with him. She had a front row seat to how quickly fortunes could turn. One moment, you're a mighty ruler. The next, you're a dethroned exile begging for support in foreign lands. Cleopatra watched her father navigate this humiliating period, quietly studying how alliances were built and deals were struck. When she later found herself in her own moment of exile, she didn't waste time feeling sorry for herself. Instead, she used what she'd learned to plan her return. Her comeback wasn't just a matter of slipping back into the palace unnoticed, though. Cleopatra's path to reclaiming the throne was dangerous and bold. She didn't try to play nice with Ptolemy XIII or his advisors. Instead, she sought out someone with even more power, someone who could tip the scales in her favor. That someone was Julius Caesar, the most influential man in Rome at the time. Cleopatra famously smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a rug, a move that wasn't just theatrical but strategic. It set the tone for her entire reign, dramatic, audacious, and always forward-thinking. But we'll get to that part of the story later. For now, it's worth asking, how does this kind of upbringing shape a person? Cleopatra wasn't born the confident, politically savvy queen we think of today. She was molded by betrayal, exile, and the constant threat of losing everything. Her resilience came from enduring what would break most people. Growing up among the Ptolemies meant learning early that weakness had no place in power. You either fought for your survival, or you didn't survive at all. Even her relationships with her siblings were defined by this brutal reality. Cleopatra eventually had her youngest sister, Arsinoe IV, executed, an act that may sound unthinkable, but wasn't unusual in her world. Arsinoe had allied herself with those who opposed Cleopatra's rule, a betrayal that Cleopatra couldn't overlook. This wasn't the cutthroat act of a cold-hearted villain. It was the calculation of someone who understood what was at stake. In her mind, allowing Arsinoe to live could have meant losing the throne, and for Cleopatra, survival and sovereignty were always intertwined. As much as Hollywood has painted Cleopatra as a glamorous figure, lounging on gold couches and seducing powerful men, the reality is that she spent much of her life fighting just to hold on to what little she had. By the time she claimed the throne on her own terms, she had already endured more betrayal and hardship than most people could imagine. Cleopatra wasn't handed power. She clawed her way to it, inch by painstaking inch, in a world that wanted her to fail at every turn. And it's this fight, this perseverance that makes her so fascinating. Cleopatra wasn't just battling her brother or the politics of her own household. She was battling a system designed to keep her down. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, wasn't a peaceful kingdom. It was a powder keg, constantly on the verge of explosion. Cleopatra didn't inherit a stable empire. She inherited chaos. And yet, she managed to carve out a place for herself in that chaos, proving time and again that she was stronger than anyone expected. But her struggles at home were only one part of the story. Beyond the palace walls, Egypt itself was in turmoil. The empire her ancestors had built was crumbling, threatened by internal corruption and external forces alike. And looming just beyond Egypt's borders was Rome. a growing superpower with ambitions that would soon come crashing into Cleopatra's world. To truly understand Cleopatra, you have to look not just at the woman, but at the fragile kingdom she inherited, a kingdom already standing on the edge of collapse. What's remarkable isn't just that Cleopatra survived in this environment, it's that, for a time, she managed to thrive. But her fight was far from over. Imagine inheriting a kingdom that's already teetering on the edge. Like a house with a cracked foundation everybody insists will hold for just a little longer. That's what Cleopatra walked into. By the time she rose to power, Egypt, once the dazzling jewel of the ancient world, was more like a fragile vase someone kept patching up with tape. And it wasn't just time or bad luck causing the cracks. Political infighting, an unstable economy, and Rome's growing dominance were making Egypt look, to outsiders, less like a formidable empire and more like an easy prize. Here's the situation Cleopatra faced. Her family, the Ptolemies, may have ruled Egypt for centuries, but they were Greeks, not Egyptians. This meant that their connection to the people of Egypt was, let's just say, distant. The Ptolemaic kings spoke Greek, their court operated in Greek, and they spent more time worrying about their rivals in the Mediterranean than they did addressing their own citizens' struggles. Over time, that lack of connection turned into outright decay. As Roman power spread eastward, the Ptolemies had become more and more reliant on Roman support to keep their crowns from slipping. By Cleopatra's time, Egypt wasn't just a sovereign kingdom. It was a pawn in the much larger chess game between the Roman elite, each of whom saw Egypt's wealth as key to controlling the known world. Rome's eyes weren't on Egypt out of curiosity. They wanted its grain. Think of it this way. In the ancient world, Egypt was basically the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Its fertile farmlands and the predictability of the Nile's floods made it a critical supplier of food to empires across the region. Sure, Cleopatra's Alexandria was famous for its art, its temples, and that colossal, flickering lighthouse. But underneath all the glamour, it was Egypt's ability to feed armies and cities that made it so important. If you controlled Egypt, you controlled the stomachs of half the Mediterranean world. Meanwhile, Cleopatra wasn't exactly being handed the keys to a well-oiled machine. The economy was a mess, strained by the Ptolemies' habit of overspending and overtaxing. Heavy-handed policies had worn down local populations, especially farmers. And for much of her young life, Cleopatra watched her father barely keep Rome happy enough to stay on that shaky throne of his. When he died, the game of keeping Egypt afloat and keeping Rome at bay fell directly to Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. And as we've already seen, they didn't exactly get along. Their power struggle hit its low point when Ptolemy XIII exiled Cleopatra. And when I say exile, I don't mean a gentle take-a-vacation suggestion. Cleopatra had to flee Egypt entirely, leaving her people, her allies, and her claim to the throne behind. She ended up in Syria, a defeated young ruler with nothing but her wits. Let's pause for a second and imagine that. You're in your early 20s, with your brother, a teenager himself, taking over the throne that should have been shared. Everyone back home is treating you like old news, and you're essentially hoping nobody sends an assassin after you while you try to figure out what to do next. Not exactly the glamorous image of Cleopatra we've been fed in popular culture. While Cleopatra was in exile, Egypt's situation worsened. Ptolemy XIII's handlers, the real powers behind his throne, weren't doing much to keep Egypt stable. Rome was sniffing around more than ever, particularly now that Julius Caesar had won his civil war and was looking for ways to solidify his control over the Roman Republic. Egypt, wealthy and unstable, was a tempting target for someone like Caesar, and Cleopatra, watching events unfold from a distance, realized something critical. She wasn't just fighting her brother for the Egyptian throne. She was fighting for Egypt itself, because if she couldn't reclaim her spot, Rome likely wouldn't wait long before taking the kingdom by force. This is where Cleopatra's understanding of politics, alliances, and risk began to set her apart. Unlike her brother, propped up by his advisors, she wasn't going to sit and hope the problem solved itself. Cleopatra decided to act, and not cautiously either. Her approach to reclaiming Egypt was bold enough to become the stuff of legend. The most famous part of this comeback story? Cleopatra's dramatic meeting with Caesar, where she supposedly snuck into his quarters rolled up in a rug, unfurling herself in front of him like an ancient, ta-da, magic trick. Corny as it sounds, this wasn't about theatrics. For one, it avoided Ptolemy's guards, which made the meeting possible. More importantly, it reminded Caesar that Cleopatra wasn't just some exiled ruler. She was someone willing to bet everything on a single throw of the dice. And for an ambitious man like Caesar, that kind of audacity was magnetic. Cleopatra didn't waste time trying to appeal to Caesar's softer side. She leaned into the practical, making him see the benefit of her reclaiming the throne with his support. A puppet king like Ptolemy XIII could only pledge so much loyalty, but Cleopatra, eager to regain power, was in a position to bargain, and she made sure Caesar knew it. The Roman sources are biased, of course. They loved portraying Cleopatra as some kind of seductress, glossing over her intellect. But what we do know is that her arguments worked. Caesar took her side, bringing the full force of his legions to back up her claim. But Cleopatra's fight to reclaim her throne wasn't without cost. Turning to Caesar meant tying Egypt's fate to Rome's ambitions, a dangerous gamble that had no guarantees. First, there was the open conflict with her brother. The disagreement between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII wasn't resolved through talking it out. It ended with open warfare culminating in the siege of Alexandria. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra's forces fought against Ptolemy's army in a brutal clash that left parts of the city in ruins. Cleopatra may have been positioning herself as Egypt's savior, but it's worth noting that reclaiming the throne came at a steep price for her people, many of whom paid for the political maneuvers of their rulers in blood and destruction. In the end, Cleopatra won the conflict, with Ptolemy XIII drowning in the Nile while trying to escape after a final defeat. With him gone, Cleopatra took the throne, alongside yet another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Though, let's be real, her new co-ruler was less a partner and more a placeholder. Cleopatra now controlled Egypt, but she still had debts to pay. Caesar's intervention wasn't free charity. It came with an expectation that Cleopatra would ensure Egypt remained a loyal ally to Rome. Still, Cleopatra had done what so many thought impossible. She hadn't just reclaimed her position as queen. She had solidified it in the face of both internal and external threats. But here's the twist. Winning back her crown didn't fix Egypt's deeper problems. The economy remained fragile, the people were restless, and Rome's influence continued to loom. Cleopatra understood this all too well. Securing her place on the throne wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. By forming an alliance with Caesar, Cleopatra was walking a tightrope. The Roman world was volatile, and being tied to Caesar's fortunes meant everything she just fought for could crumble if he fell. To keep Egypt afloat, Cleopatra had to be more than just a ruler. She had to be a strategist, constantly thinking 2 steps ahead of both her enemies and her supposed allies. What makes Cleopatra's story so remarkable isn't just that she managed to claw her way back to power. It's that she did so in a storm of political chaos and against the backdrop of a kingdom on the verge of falling apart. Few rulers in history have faced situations as precarious as hers and lived to tell the tale. At just 21 years old, Cleopatra wasn't just ruling Egypt. She was protecting it from becoming another Roman province. And unlike the male rulers who had come before her, she had the added difficulty of navigating a world that inherently distrusted women in power. She wasn't just successful, she was rewriting what it meant to lead under impossible circumstances. At a time when Rome dominated most of the Mediterranean, Cleopatra managed to keep Egypt from being swallowed whole. And for a brief, shining moment, it looked like she might even be able to chart her kingdom's future on her own terms. But as we'll see, her alliances with Rome's most powerful men, first Caesar and later Mark Antony, would come with costs she could never fully control. Because keeping Rome's attention was one thing, keeping them out of Egypt was another. Cleopatra's relationships weren't the fluttery romances you might imagine from epic films or pop culture. There wasn't much time for love letters or starlit strolls along the Nile. Instead, her alliances were calculated moves, measured as carefully as the weight of her crown. Every connection she made with powerful Roman figures came with enormous risks. The stakes? Nothing less than the survival of Egypt itself. If you're thinking this sounds exhausting and, well, a little mercenary, you'd be absolutely right. For Cleopatra, survival and politics were one and the same, and her relationships were part of that bloody chessboard. Let's start with Julius Caesar. He was a man whose reputation had already steamrolled its way across Rome and beyond. Cleopatra saw in Caesar more than just a colossal ego, although, let's be honest, that was very much present. She saw an opportunity to reclaim her power. After her brother Ptolemy XIII unceremoniously pushed her out of Egypt, Cleopatra knew she couldn't simply stroll back into Alexandria and demand her kingdom back. She needed someone with muscle. Enter Caesar, fresh off a Roman civil war, brimming with ambition, and all too aware of Egypt's vast resources. He wasn't someone you could charm with a polite letter or a persuasive speech. No, Cleopatra needed to make an impression, and she relied on her trademark boldness to do it. The story of Cleopatra meeting Caesar has become the stuff of legend. You've heard it before, right? Cleopatra, smuggled into Caesar's chambers, hidden inside a rug. It's easy to dismiss this moment as theatrical, maybe even ridiculous, but consider the message it sent. She was audacious, unafraid, and willing to take enormous risks to get his attention. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a power move, rolled up in tapestry. Caesar, for all his cunning, likely hadn't come across anything quite like it. The politics here were as critical as the spectacle. Cleopatra wasn't merely asking for help. She was showing Caesar that she was worth the gamble. And gamble he did. Supporting Cleopatra meant going to war on her behalf, something that wasn't exactly low-key in the middle of a fragile Roman political landscape. In their alliance, Cleopatra promised loyalty to Rome, and in return, Caesar gave her a way back to the throne. Together, they defeated Ptolemy XIII during the chaotic siege of Alexandria. It was a partnership born from mutual necessity, but it came with costs. For one, aligning so closely with Caesar tethered Cleopatra's fate to his. To secure her power, she had to lean into Rome's shadow, knowing full well that Rome was also the looming threat that could one day swallow her kingdom whole. It was the ultimate gamble. And yet, Cleopatra wasn't passive in this relationship. She knew precisely what Egypt had to offer: grain, wealth, and a strong position on the Mediterranean. And she played those strengths adeptly. Her time with Caesar had other complications too. What started as a political alliance didn't stay strictly political. The two became romantically involved, and Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion. To Cleopatra, this wasn't just personal, it was a calculated move. A son linked to Caesar, Rome's most powerful man, added to her legitimacy back home and abroad. But let's not over-romanticize this situation. While Caesarion may have been a point of pride for Cleopatra, the reality was far too messy to qualify as some epic love story. Caesar was already married, his political enemies were watching his every move, and his relationship with Cleopatra was feeding into narratives that portrayed her as a manipulative foreign queen. But for Cleopatra, the strategy worked in the short term. With Caesar's backing, she regained her throne and secured her position in Alexandria. But alliances with men as powerful as Caesar rarely came without heartbreak or disaster. After his assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's carefully balanced world fell out from under her. Caesar's death threw Rome into chaos, splitting power between several factions, none of whom seemed particularly interested in Egypt's sovereignty. Cleopatra suddenly found herself navigating the fallout of a partnership that had once offered her kingdom a lifeline. Her ties to Caesar made her a target, especially since her son, Caesarion, could now be seen as a threat by those jockeying for power in Rome. If Roman politics had always been brutal, they were about to reach Shakespearean levels of treachery. And this is where Mark Antony steps onto the stage. Of all the alliances in Cleopatra's life, this one often gets the most attention. It's been painted as a passionate, tragic love affair, a kind of ancient Romeo and Juliet for Mediterranean royalty. But let's be clear, much like her connection with Caesar, Cleopatra's alliance with Antony was first and foremost about survival. Rome was fractured into a shaky leadership trio, with Antony controlling the eastern provinces that bordered Egypt. For Cleopatra, building a relationship with Antony wasn't optional, it was necessary. Their partnership began in 41 BCE, when Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, likely to assess whether Egypt would continue to support Rome's cause, or, more accurately, his cause, as tensions brewed with Octavian, Caesar's heir. Cleopatra's arrival, true to form, wasn't just a visit, it was a performance. She sailed in on a gilded barge, decked out as the goddess Aphrodite, the air around her thick with incense. It was spectacle meets diplomacy, a moment designed not only to dazzle Antony, but to remind him of the wealth and power she represented. Antony, drawn to grand gestures and bold personalities, was captivated. From there, their relationship deepened, both politically and personally. Like her connection with Caesar, Cleopatra relied on Antony to help protect Egypt from Roman interference while strengthening her position as queen. For Antony, the alliance offered access to Egypt's vast resources, which he needed to fund his campaign against Parthia, Rome's rival in the east. Their connection was mutually advantageous, but also fraught with danger. Antony's enemies back in Rome, particularly Octavian, weren't blind to the alliance forming between the two. To them, this wasn't just a political partnership. It was ammunition for propaganda. Octavian wasted no time spinning their relationship into a scandal. He portrayed Cleopatra as the ultimate foreign threat, a cunning seductress who had bewitched a Roman leader. Antony, once viewed as a brilliant military commander, was now painted as a lovesick fool, abandoning his Roman duties to live in luxury at Cleopatra's side. It was a smear campaign at its finest, designed not just to discredit Antony, but to prepare Rome for war against Cleopatra herself. For Cleopatra, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Aligning with Antony wasn't just a move to strengthen Egypt, it also painted a target on her back. That target would only grow as tensions between the trio of Roman leaders reached a breaking point. Antony's fortunes began shifting, and Cleopatra's position became more precarious by the day. Together, they saw their forces defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a massive naval confrontation that marked the beginning of the end for both Antony and Cleopatra. After their loss, they fled back to Alexandria, their power dwindling and their enemies closing in. Cleopatra had backed another losing horse, and this time there would be no comeback. Looking at these alliances, first with Caesar, then with Antony, you can see a pattern. Cleopatra wasn't driven by romance. She was driven by the need to protect her kingdom in a world that seemed bent on dismantling it. These relationships were survival strategies, not fairy tales, but they came at a heavy cost. The men she depended on for protection were the very ones who tied her fate to Rome, making it impossible for her to ever truly secure Egypt's independence. What makes Cleopatra's story so haunting is how much she risked and how fragile those risks made her position. Aligning with Caesar gave her power, but also painted her as a manipulative foreign queen in Roman eyes. Aligning with Antony gave her protection, but ultimately tied her fortunes to a man who couldn't stand against the rising tide of Octavian's influence. And in both cases, Cleopatra found herself losing more than she gained, watching as her calculated alliances slowly unraveled. It's tempting to think of Cleopatra's relationships as the marks of a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to survive. And in many ways, that's true. But survival itself wasn't enough. Cleopatra didn't just want to keep her throne. She wanted to keep Egypt from becoming another jewel in Rome's imperial crown. These alliances, as risky as they weren't acts of desperation. They were acts of defiance. A queen's attempt to carve out space for her kingdom in the shadow of an unstoppable empire. But the weight of those alliances wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. Cleopatra didn't just gamble with her power or her kingdom. She gambled with her legacy. And as the walls began closing in on her, both figuratively and literally, that gamble would take a toll no throne or crown could ever justify. How do you destroy a queen's power? You don't march an army into her throne room. You don't challenge her in a duel or even fight her in a proper battle. Instead, you take her name and twist it until people can't picture her as anything other than a threat. You make her dangerous in their minds before she even lifts a finger. Cleopatra knew how to fight wars on land and at sea, but this was something harder to defend against. A war fought through words, not swords. During Cleopatra's reign, Rome had a messaging system as brutal as its armies. Its propaganda could reduce entire countries into caricatures, boiling people down to stereotypes to justify war, conquest, and control. Cleopatra, as the Queen of Egypt, and now deeply entangled with Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, became a prime target. Not because of who she actually was, but because of what Rome needed her to be. To them, Cleopatra wasn't a ruler protecting her kingdom. She was a foreign queen, an outsider who, conveniently, could be blamed for every apparent misstep of the Roman men who aligned themselves with her. Octavian, later known as Augustus, was particularly skilled at using propaganda as a weapon. After Caesar's assassination, and as the rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian grew more heated, Cleopatra became a symbol Octavian could manipulate. He couldn't just frame Antony as a military adversary. He needed to paint Antony as something much worse: weak, irresponsible, and completely under Cleopatra's control. This is where Cleopatra starts to show up in Roman accounts as less of a human being and more of a storybook villain. The Romans loved telling stories that made women either paragons of virtue or absolute disasters, and Cleopatra landed squarely in the disaster camp. Take, for instance, their relentless focus on her sexuality. To them, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a seductress, someone who used men as pawns in her political schemes. Octavian's propagandists portrayed her not as a strategic political leader, but as a kind of witch, a woman who supposedly bewitched Caesar and Antony with her charms. Never mind her intelligence, her fluency in multiple languages, or her ability to lead a kingdom in a male-dominated world. No, her power had to be explained away as some form of spellcasting, because the idea that a woman could command respect through sheer talent, that was too much for Rome to handle. One of the most infamous plays on this theme came during Octavian's build-up to his war against Antony and Cleopatra. He needed public support for what was essentially an internal Roman conflict. Antony was a rival in power, but Cleopatra? Octavian turned her into a looming nightmare. Roman poets and writers, encouraged of course by the political climate, began spinning stories of Cleopatra as a kind of Eastern temptress, a chaotic force who had somehow corrupted Antony, a proud Roman general. In their version of the story, Antony wasn't making calculated decisions as a political leader. He was staggering under the influence of Cleopatra's supposed spells. Here's one lie spread far and wide, that Cleopatra was planning to overthrow Rome itself. Think about how absurd that is. Egypt, while significant, was already struggling to maintain its sovereignty. It was hardly in a position to launch some grand offensive against an empire as massive as Rome. But propaganda doesn't rely on reality. It's about what people believe. Octavian pushed the narrative that Cleopatra had Antony totally enthralled, convincing him to turn his back on Rome and rule with her as co-emperors of a new, corrupt Eastern Empire. It painted Cleopatra as more than just a nuisance. She became an almost mythical villain, threatening Rome's very identity. They weren't subtle about it either. Coins were minted with Antony and Cleopatra, depicted side by side, a deliberate attempt to suggest that Antony was no longer a true Roman, but a puppet of Egypt. Some coins even gave Cleopatra titles that exaggerated her influence, such as the audacious claim that she was the Queen of Kings. To a Roman audience, fed these images daily, Cleopatra seemed larger than life, yet utterly monstrous. She wasn't only a woman seizing power in her own kingdom. She was cast as someone clawing at Rome's very foundation. Even the tiniest details about Cleopatra were weaponized. Consider her wealth, for example. Roman sources portrayed her as a symbol of decadence and luxury, living a life far removed from the supposed discipline and virtue of a Roman citizen. Never mind that rulers in Rome were just as extravagant, if not more so. Cleopatra's Egyptian opulence now became proof of her supposed corruption. It wasn't enough that she was trying to protect Egypt. In Roman eyes, she was trying to upend the moral order of the world itself. If wealth and influence weren't enough to paint her as a villain, her foreign identity certainly sealed the deal. Romans were already deeply suspicious of cultures they didn't fully understand, and Cleopatra, as Queen of Egypt, naturally became the face of everything Rome supposedly wasn't. Egypt's traditions, its gods, its art, all of it seemed exotic and unfamiliar to a Roman audience, who were quick to associate that unfamiliarity with danger. Cleopatra wasn't just a foreigner. She was painted as an other, someone inherently untrustworthy because she wasn't Roman. Never mind that she was Greek by heritage. Her association with Egypt was enough to stir up fear and anger back in Rome. Of course, this portrayal ignored how Cleopatra was perceived at home. In Egypt, she wasn't some conniving villain. She was seen as a protector, even a divine figure. Cleopatra styled herself as the embodiment of the goddess Isis, a move that wasn't new to Egyptian rulers, but was particularly poignant in her time. Isis represented motherhood, magic, and protection, all qualities that Cleopatra embraced in her role as queen. Where Rome saw decadence, many Egyptians saw a leader trying desperately to keep their country intact amid relentless Roman pressure. But Octavian's propaganda machine didn't care about nuance. In their version of events, Cleopatra's ties to Egypt only added to her supposed crimes, making her appear even more alien and unrelatable to the Roman public. The worst part of all this propaganda isn't just how false it was, it's how effective it remains. These images of Cleopatra as a seductress, a foreign temptress, and a figure of chaos have persisted for centuries. Much of what we think we know about her today comes from Roman sources, written years after her death, by people with every incentive to make her look terrible. Historians like Plutarch and Dio Cassius may not have been there to witness Cleopatra's fall, but their writings carried the echoes of Octavian's smear campaign. Even modern adaptations of Cleopatra's story tend to lean into these stereotypes, portraying her as a woman defined primarily by her relationships with powerful men, rather than as a ruler in her own right. Propaganda doesn't just destroy reputations, it rewrites legacies. Cleopatra wasn't just fighting Octavian on the battlefield, she was fighting him in the public's imagination. And while her armies ultimately lost, it's worth noting that she never lost the loyalty of her people in Egypt. To them, she remained a queen who fought against impossible odds, someone who used every tool at her disposal to try and preserve what was left of Egypt's independence. Roman narratives couldn't erase that, but Cleopatra knew the propaganda war wasn't just about her. It was also about how Rome saw itself. Octavian didn't smear Cleopatra because he feared her as an individual. He smeared her because he feared what she represented. She was a challenge to Rome's growing dominance, proof that a foreign queen could stand her ground against an empire that prided itself on its might and tradition. By defeating her in both rhetoric and war, Octavian wasn't just solidifying his own power. He was asserting Rome's claim to rule the world. Yet, for all Octavian's efforts, Cleopatra's story remains larger than the caricature he painted. Her intelligence, her political savvy, and her determination to fight for her people have managed to survive the centuries, even buried under layers of bias. And in many ways, that's the ultimate testament to her power. Cleopatra may have been vilified in her time, but she wasn't forgotten. And the fact that we're still talking about her today, that says more about her enduring strength than any Roman lie ever could. What does it feel like to stand at the top, knowing the world below was never meant to hold you there? To rule in a game created by men, for men, while they watched your every move, waiting for you to falter. This was Cleopatra's daily reality. The moment she took the throne, Every step became a negotiation between survival and the constant pressure to prove she even deserved to lead. For the men who surrounded her, both her allies and her enemies, Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler. She was an inconvenience, an outlier, and most dangerously, a challenge to a system that wasn't designed for her to succeed. In Cleopatra's world, power wasn't neutral, and it wasn't hers to share freely. The men in Rome, and even within her own court, saw leadership as their birthright. Egypt under the Ptolemies wasn't new to queens. Cleopatra herself was the culmination of a long line of female rulers. But her reign came at a time when women in power were viewed with even more suspicion than usual. Rome was expanding like a hungry beast. It was conquering lands, swallowing cultures, and forcing its ideas, including rigid patriarchal ideals, onto every society it touched. In their eyes, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was the wrong kind of queen. Foreign, ambitious, and, worst of all, unapologetically female. To add to the challenge, Cleopatra's intelligence didn't exactly make her popular with her male peers. Let's get this out of the way. Cleopatra wasn't just charming. She was brilliant. Roman sources, often begrudgingly, admit she spoke multiple languages fluently, including Egyptian, which was notable, considering most of the Ptolemies before her hadn't even bothered to learn it. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric, disciplines typically reserved for elite men. It's said she could switch between Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and other tongues without hesitation. Her ability to connect with people, from diplomats to soldiers, wasn't a fluke. It was the sharp edge she wielded to stay ahead, knowing full well that she would never be allowed to coast on her title alone. But of course, being brilliant wasn't enough to shield her from the weaponization of her gender. The Roman propaganda machine wasted no time reducing Cleopatra to a caricature, as we already explored. Her successes couldn't be attributed to strategy or intellect. They had to be dismissed as byproducts of manipulation. The men she allied herself with, the Caesars and Mark Antonys of the world, were praised for their cunning and leadership, even as they made mistakes. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was framed as a schemer, a seductress who gained power not through merit, but through the destruction of greater men. It was never that she worked with Caesar to reclaim Egypt's throne. It was that she lured him. It wasn't that she strengthened Antony's forces. It was that she bewitched him. You can almost hear the eye rolling in those Roman accounts. Even within Egypt, her gender wasn't always an easy sell. As a ruler, Cleopatra had to constantly straddle two identities. To the Egyptians, she portrayed herself as a divine figure, tying her image to the goddess Isis. Isis wasn't just a powerful deity. She was a mother figure, a protector, and a symbol of renewal. By aligning herself with Isis, Cleopatra wasn't just claiming religious authority, she was addressing centuries of Egyptian tradition. But to the Greeks of Alexandria, steeped in their own patriarchal values, her role often required her to act less as a divine figure and more as a diplomatic powerhouse. Balancing these expectations wasn't just draining, it was isolating. Cleopatra had to hold together two worlds that often clashed, all while facing constant challenges from those who saw her as an outsider in both. And let's talk about that isolation. Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler. She was a single mother, a female head of state, and a political target, all rolled into one. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The men in her orbit, whether they were brothers, Roman generals, or advisors, were as much threats as they were allies. Even her relationships with Caesar and Antony, undoubtedly among the most significant connections of her life, were built in part on the calculation that they could turn against her at any moment. Her power rested on alliances that were, by nature, unstable. When Antony lost favor in Rome, Cleopatra bore the brunt of the blame. When Caesar was assassinated, her carefully built rapport with him evaporated into thin air. And behind all of this loomed the question, when the men she depended on inevitably failed her, who would have her back? But this isolation didn't make Cleopatra weaker. If anything, it refined her. She didn't have the luxury of making mistakes, and when she did, even the smallest ones were magnified by the men who wanted her gone. This forced her to become one of the savviest political operators of her time. Cleopatra knew how to read a room, how to command attention, and how to turn situations to her advantage, even when the odds were stacked against her. Take her infamous meeting with Antony in Tarsus. Rather than approach him as a supplicant begging for favor, she arrived in full regalia, as Aphrodite incarnate, showing Antony that she was not just another vassal ruler, but his equal, or at least someone who demanded to be treated as one. She didn't come to beg. She came to negotiate. Even her so-called extravagance, so often criticized in Roman propaganda, reveals a calculated brilliance. Cleopatra's immense wealth was an undeniable part of her political strategy. She used it to impress, dazzle, and, in some cases, intimidate. Lavish gifts, grand processions, and displays of opulence weren't just about indulgence. They were tools of diplomacy. Cleopatra understood that presentation mattered, especially when the people across the table from her were already predisposed to see her as inferior. If they wanted to underestimate her, she made sure her station was impossible to ignore. But the question remains, how long can anyone live like this? Cleopatra may have been resilient, but she was still human. How do you bear the weight of not just ruling a kingdom, but doing so in a way that challenges every expectation placed on you? How do you navigate a world that seems determined to remind you, at every turn, that it wasn't built for you to lead? Cleopatra's intelligence and resolve kept her in the game, but they didn't shield her from the toll this constant vigilance must have taken. Behind the stories of her political maneuvering and larger-than-life persona lies a more sobering truth. Cleopatra had no equals. Her role, by design, was one of isolation. Finding someone who understood the weight of her crown was impossible. Caesar and Antony weren't her equals. Her brothers weren't allies. Her advisors were as likely to betray her as they were to support her. And because of this, Cleopatra had to always be one step ahead, always calculating, always performing. Ruling in a world built for men didn't allow for a single moment of rest. Still, Cleopatra's isolation did something extraordinary. It sharpened her determination to fight for Egypt's survival. For all the challenges pulled from her gender, her foreign identity, and the condescending eyes of Rome, Cleopatra never stopped pushing to protect her kingdom. She never stopped trying to position Egypt as an independent power, even as Rome advanced with its banners and armies. She didn't give up when Caesar fell, or when Antony's reputation crumbled under Octavian's propaganda. Her fight was constant, her resilience unrelenting. It didn't break her, not yet. But the reality of leading alone came at a cost. The cracks were beginning to show, not just in Cleopatra's alliances, but in Egypt itself. Rome's power wasn't diminishing. Octavian's ambition wasn't slowing down. And as Cleopatra stood alone, carrying the weight of her kingdom, the final threads holding everything together were beginning to fray. No amount of cunning or charisma could halt the forces bearing down on her world. Eventually, something had to give. The question wasn't whether Cleopatra could hold on, but for how long and at what price. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the ground beneath you crumble inch by inch, knowing there's nowhere to run. That's what Cleopatra saw as her kingdom began to collapse right in front of her. For decades, she'd outmaneuvered rivals, outlasted betrayals, and even outsmarted Rome's propaganda machine, up to a point. But by the time Antony's defeats began to pile up, with Octavian closing in like a storm in slow motion, even Cleopatra couldn't stop what was coming. This wasn't just the loss of a throne, it was the destruction of an entire empire she'd spent her life trying to hold together. The turning point came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. This was no minor skirmish. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of an all-in poker game. Mark Antony and Cleopatra joined forces, throwing everything they had into this naval clash against Octavian's fleet. To say the stakes were high is an understatement. If they won, they'd secure their grip on the eastern Mediterranean. If they lost, they'd lose everything. The problem? Rome had been tightening its grip for years, building alliances and systematically dismantling Antony and Cleopatra's support. By the time they met Octavian's fleet at Actium, it wasn't a fair fight. Octavian's general Agrippa had outmaneuvered them before the first blow was even struck, cutting off Antony and Cleopatra's supply lines and leaving them at a massive disadvantage. What happened next was disastrous. Antony's forces broke ranks under pressure, and instead of holding their ground, Cleopatra made the split-second decision to retreat with her fleet. It's a decision historians still debate today. Was it panic? Was it strategic? Did Antony know she was going to retreat? Or did she leave him, and many of their soldiers, behind in the chaos? Whatever the reason, that retreat was the beginning of the end. Antony followed her, abandoning the battle and his remaining men, sealing their defeat. Octavian's forces took the victory, and with it, the upper hand in their war. For Cleopatra, the retreat from Actium wasn't just the loss of a battle, it was the collapse of the mythology she'd built around herself. This was the woman who had outsmarted her brother, who had stared down Caesar and charmed Antony. In Egypt, she wasn't just a ruler, she was a goddess, the living embodiment of Isis herself. And yet, even goddesses couldn't outrun the realities of war. As she returned to Alexandria, her kingdom in shambles, Cleopatra had to reckon with one cold truth. Rome was coming, and all the alliances, ships, and gold in the world might not be enough to stop it. From that point on, Cleopatra threw everything she had into survival. There are moments in history where desperation meets brilliance, and this was one of them. Cleopatra wasn't the type to sit and wait for fate to decide her end. Instead, she tried to negotiate with Octavian. Historians believe she sent him emissaries, gifts, and proposals, all in an effort to carve out some kind of future for Egypt. She played every card she had, offering alliances, tribute, and even her own son, Caesarion, as a potential co-ruler under Roman oversight. But Octavian wasn't interested in deals. He was after one thing: control. Cleopatra's offers weren't just rejected, they were ignored, as Octavian pushed forward with his invasion plans. It wasn't just Cleopatra he was targeting, it was Egypt itself. For Rome, this wasn't about one woman or her allies. Egypt had always been the prize. Its wealth, its grain, its strategic position in the Mediterranean. All of it made Egypt invaluable to a restless empire hungry for expansion. Octavian understood that Cleopatra was the last obstacle standing between Rome and full control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Taking her out wouldn't just be a victory, it would be his crowning achievement. Cleopatra, as always, wasn't blind to the politics at play. She knew Octavian wasn't the type to spare captured enemies, especially not ones who had humiliated him through years of propaganda about her supposed control over Antony. She had watched what had happened to other rulers who crossed Rome. Julius Caesar, a man she knew intimately, had paraded his defeated foes through the streets of Rome during his triumphs, chaining them in front of cheering crowds. Cleopatra understood how Octavian's mind worked, and she could see the writing on the wall. If he captured her, she wouldn't just lose her freedom. She would be turned into a trophy, and Octavian had already prepared for this moment. His propaganda campaign by this time had all but solidified the idea that Cleopatra was not a legitimate ruler, but a foreign temptress, manipulating Rome's greatest generals. Capturing her, dragging her through the streets of Rome, and presenting her as the ultimate conquest would serve his ambitions perfectly. He would present himself as the savior of Rome, the one who overcame the corrupting influence of the treacherous East. To Cleopatra, this wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was the final nail in the coffin for Egypt's sovereignty. Let's not forget what Cleopatra was trying to protect. By this time, Egypt wasn't the dazzling empire it had been centuries earlier under the great pharaohs, but it was still one of the most important powers in the region. It was a land of immense wealth, where the Nile provided resources that could sustain armies and feed entire populations. For Cleopatra, Egypt was more than just territory. It was her identity, her son's future, and the last piece of stability in a world that had been under siege for years. Giving it over to Rome wasn't just losing her crown, it was losing everything. So how does a queen prepare for the end when there's nowhere left to run? Cleopatra, strategic to the very end, didn't stop scheming. She fortified Alexandria as best she could, gathering the remnants of her forces and trying to mount some kind of resistance. Antony, broken by the defeat at Actium, struggled to rally himself, leaving much of the responsibility in Cleopatra's hands. But even she must have known it was futile. Rome's armies were closing in, and there was no army large enough, no fleet strong enough to turn the tide. Cleopatra wasn't just fighting to delay the inevitable, she was trying to control how the story ended. When Octavian finally reached Alexandria in 30 BCE, the city was already a shadow of its former self. Antony, in his final stand, tried to rally his troops, but when defeat became certain, he fell on his sword, choosing death over capture. Cleopatra, now truly alone, faced the final moment of her reign. Octavian demanded her surrender, but Cleopatra wasn't about to let herself be paraded through Roman streets, a captive queen turned propaganda tool. She knew that if she couldn't save Egypt, at the very least, she could deny Rome the satisfaction of using her as a pawn one final time. But before we get to Cleopatra's ultimate decision, it's worth reflecting on just how systematically Rome dismantled everything she fought for. Her survival wasn't just about battles. It was about enduring years of political manipulation, propaganda, and betrayal. Egypt didn't fall because Cleopatra failed. It fell because it had become the last great prize for a Roman Empire hungry for expansion. Once Octavian set his sights on Egypt, Cleopatra's resistance became not just impossible, but almost irrelevant. Rome's machine was simply too powerful. And yet, even in these final days, Cleopatra didn't give up her agency. as the walls closed in and her escape routes vanished one by one, she made the decision that would define her legacy, not as a ruler defeated, but as a queen who refused to let her enemies define her end. In those final days, she was no longer fighting for her throne, her alliances, or even her survival. She was fighting for something far harder to take away, her dignity. Cleopatra's realization wasn't just personal, it was political. By the time Octavian marched into Alexandria, her fate was no longer just her own. It was the fate of her culture, her people, and her son. And in those final moments, as Alexandria burned and Rome's banners flew high, Cleopatra made a choice that said more about her spirit than any victory or defeat ever could. Cleopatra's final chapter begins in Alexandria, a city she had long called home, but that now felt more like a cage. Octavian had arrived, victorious and calculating, with one goal: to claim Egypt not just as territory, but as a statement. Defeating Cleopatra, the so-called seductress queen, the foreign threat, the last gasp of Egypt's independence, wasn't enough. He wanted her alive. It wasn't charity or restraint that motivated him. He was planning the ultimate spectacle, a triumph in Rome where Cleopatra, bound in chains, would be paraded as a conquered enemy. The Queen of Egypt, reduced to nothing more than a trophy to cement his power. Cleopatra wasn't naive about what awaited her. She had seen the way captives fared in Roman triumphs. Humiliated, mocked, dragged through crowds as jeering symbols of defeat. She knew her name would be echoed through the streets of Rome, but not as a leader or a goddess. Instead, as a warning to anyone who dared to defy the might of the empire. For a woman who had spent her life commanding rooms, outthinking rivals, and ruling as a living symbol of Isis herself, this wasn't a future she was willing to embrace. Death, in her eyes, wasn't the end of her story. It was an escape from being rewritten entirely. And so, Cleopatra, cunning and deliberate until the very last moment, began to plan her next move. With Octavian's forces occupying Alexandria, she was under constant surveillance. Octavian knew her reputation well enough to insist that his guards keep watch, likely fearing that she might use the same guile that had impressed men like Caesar and Antony to slip through his fingers. She was reportedly surrounded on all sides, trapped in her palace. Yet Cleopatra had never been one to let a handful of guards dictate her decisions. If Octavian wanted her alive, Cleopatra was determined to deny him the satisfaction. Mark Antony's death had come just days earlier, an event that perhaps sealed Cleopatra's resolve. After the humiliation of the loss at Actium, Antony had tried to mount some sort of final defense, one last stand to salvage what little dignity remained. But Octavian's forces were everywhere, and Antony's battered troops had no will to fight. When he heard a false report that Cleopatra had taken her own life, Antony, in grief and despair, fell on his sword. The wound didn't kill him immediately, though. Instead, he was brought, bleeding and broken, to Cleopatra, where he reportedly died in her arms. Even in their defeat, Octavian's forces made sure there was no romanticized ending for the pair. Antony died with his dreams of power shattered, and Cleopatra was left to face Rome alone. But even alone, Cleopatra wasn't passive. Accounts of her final days tell of a woman still calculating. Some sources say she attempted to appeal to Octavian personally, even hosting him to discuss her future. According to Roman writers, she presented herself with all the dignity of a queen, draped in her royal regalia as if she were negotiating terms, not begging for her life. It's easy to imagine her staring him down across the room, offering alliances, tribute, or compromises that Octavian had no intention of accepting. To Octavian, the game was already over. He wasn't there to make deals. He wanted Cleopatra to surrender entirely, on his terms, in his story. And Cleopatra knew exactly what that story would be. Rome wouldn't stop with her capture. It would twist her legacy beyond recognition. She wouldn't be remembered as the ruler who fought for Egypt, or as the last true heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Instead, she'd be reduced to Octavian's convenient villain, portrayed as the reckless, manipulative queen who brought down not just her own kingdom, but Rome's finest generals. Her son, Caesarion, whom she had once positioned as the future of Egypt, was also in danger. As Julius Caesar's only known biological child, he could be seen as a threat to Octavian's newly consolidated power. Cleopatra likely understood that Octavian would never let her son live to adulthood. At this point, Cleopatra decided her death wouldn't be a stolen moment, rushed or sloppy. It would be deliberate, controlled, entirely hers. And this is where myth and reality begin to intertwine. The most famous version of her death comes, of course, from the tale of the asp. Roman accounts claim she arranged for a small, venomous snake to be smuggled into her chambers, hidden among a basket of figs. When the time came, she held the asp to her skin, allowing it to bite her, and let its poison quietly take her life. The symbolism here is impossible to miss. Egyptians revered the cobra, a royal symbol of divine authority and protection. For Cleopatra, the asp's bite wasn't just an end. It was a final act of reasserting her identity, a choice as deliberate as any of the calculated moves that had defined her reign. That said, not all historians agree. The story of the ASB might be exactly what Octavian wanted people to believe, a dramatic but controlled narrative to further emphasize Cleopatra's supposed theatrics. Other theories suggest she may have taken poison, a substance prepared by her physicians long before she needed it. And there's another possibility, that her death was far less glamorous, with Octavian's forces allowing it to happen despite their orders to keep her alive. Whichever version is true, one thing is clear. Cleopatra robbed Octavian of his triumph. By dying on her own terms, she denied him the chance to parade her through Rome as living proof of his victory. Her suicide wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a political statement. Cleopatra wasn't merely choosing death over disgrace. She was refusing to play a part in Octavian's propaganda. By taking her life, she eluded the chains meant to reduce her to a symbol of submission. In some ways, it was her last great maneuver, one final gesture to remind the world that she was not just a queen, but a ruler who chose her battles, and ultimately, her end. The aftermath was as brutal as expected. Octavian took control of Egypt, marking the official end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Egypt as a Roman province. As for Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, his fate was sealed the moment Octavian marched into Alexandria. 2 Caesars are one too many, Octavian supposedly said, before Caesarion was executed. It was a cold move, meant to ensure no remaining trace of Cleopatra's dynasty could challenge his reign. The rest of Cleopatra's surviving children, fathered by Antony, were taken to Rome to be paraded in Octavian's triumph, but were later raised quietly by Antony's Roman wife Octavia. With Cleopatra gone, Octavian rewrote the narrative swiftly and completely. He portrayed himself as the savior of Rome, the man who had rid the empire of Antony's corruption and Cleopatra's supposedly dangerous influence. Cleopatra was left as a figment of his propaganda, vain, cunning, reckless, a figure sculpted by her enemies. And for centuries, that's the image that remained. But here's where Cleopatra's death shifts from tragedy to something far more enduring. Because no matter how hard Octavian tried, he couldn't erase her entirely. Even as the Roman version of her story spread, the reality of her life, the woman behind the caricature, refused to vanish completely. Cleopatra remains one of history's most debated figures, not because of how her reign ended, but because of how hard she fought up until the very last breath. Her death wasn't a whimper of defeat. It was a refusal to let Rome dictate her legacy. It was a queen, in the end, choosing her dignity over submission. And so here we are, over 2,000 years later, still captivated by her story. What does that tell you about Cleopatra? For all the attempts to vilify her, to reduce her life to scandal and spectacle, she still looms large, casting a shadow over the empire that sought to claim her. It wasn't Octavian's name or victory that lingered in our collective imagination. It was Cleopatra's act of defiance, living on long after the banners of Rome faded into history. Octavian may have taken her kingdom, but not her power to captivate the world. How does history deal with a queen who refused to bow? If you're Cleopatra, it means you don't just lose your kingdom, you lose control over how the world remembers you. After her death, Cleopatra's legacy wasn't handled with care. It was torn apart and reshaped by the very people who had defeated her. To Rome, she wasn't allowed to remain the intelligent, shrewd leader who had clawed her way to the top despite impossible odds. She wasn't the protector of Egypt or the careful tactician holding Rome's ambitions at bay for years. No, she had to be something simpler, something easier to hate. That's how her story was rewritten, by turning her into a figure who existed only for Rome to conquer. Let's start with the Roman authors who first recorded Cleopatra's story. They were, to no one's surprise, Octavian's people, or, by that point, Augustus's people, as he was already building his image as the noble savior of Rome. From these accounts, Cleopatra emerges less as a multidimensional leader and more as a caricature. They described her as manipulative, dangerous, and obsessed with luxury. Plutarch, who didn't even live during Cleopatra's time, wrote one of the most influential accounts of her life, saying she had an irresistible charm, and that her voice alone was like an instrument of many strings. Pretty words, but there's an agenda buried in them. Instead of focusing on her ability to rule an entire kingdom, he leaned into the same tired idea that she gained power through seduction. Tired to us, at least. To the Romans, this image was critical to justifying Octavian's conquest. If Cleopatra couldn't be seen as a legitimate leader, if she could be reduced to nothing more than an exotic tempter of great men, then taking her down felt like less of a crime and more of a duty. It wasn't just Octavian's supporters who picked apart her reputation. Once Cleopatra was dead and Egypt became a Roman province, her story entered the cultural bloodstream of an empire that needed villains to prop up its heroes. She wasn't dead 2 decades before Roman artists, poets, and playwrights took their turn at her. Horace and Virgil, 2 of Rome's most famous poets, didn't bother with subtleties. They cast her as a foreign enemy who dared to challenge Rome's destiny to rule the world. Cleopatra was no longer Cleopatra. She became that woman, not a queen, but the embodiment of everything dangerous and alien. And who stood opposite her in these retellings? Octavian. He wasn't just an emperor, he was protector of Roman honor, savior of the Republic from this terrifying, overindulgent queen. A queen who, let's not forget, was trying to save her own country from the endless appetite of the Roman Empire. The propaganda worked. It worked so well, in fact, that it outlived Octavian himself. For centuries, remnants of this image persisted, especially in Europe, which inherited much of Rome's history and its skewed interpretations. Even long after the Roman Empire crumbled, Cleopatra was still often reduced to this same narrative. Ambitious, untrustworthy, and somehow more infamous for her relationships than for ruling one of the most powerful and culturally rich regions of the ancient world. But something remarkable happened along the way. While the Romans may have succeeded in destroying Cleopatra's actual kingdom, they failed to erase the fascination people had with her. If anything, their exaggerated portrayals had the opposite effect. People couldn't stop talking about her. The mystery of Cleopatra, that thin line between who she really was and who history wanted her to be, only grew over time. It grew in art, in literature, and in the imaginations of cultures as far-flung as the very world Cleopatra herself had tried to navigate. This layered legacy is why Cleopatra has been reimagined countless times, her story reshaped depending on the lens of the era. In the works of Shakespeare, for example, Cleopatra transforms again, this time into a tragic heroine. In Antony and Cleopatra, she's no longer just a villain or a seductress. She's a complex figure grappling with love, power, and loss. Shakespeare leaned heavily on the romantic angle, crafting a Cleopatra who's beautiful and magnetic, tangled in an epic love affair with Mark Antony. But even this version, while more sympathetic, still largely reduced her to her relationships. She remained tied to the men in her life rather than celebrated as a ruler in her own right. In art, Cleopatra's mystique only deepened. She was painted by master artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme and Lawrence Alma-Tadema, often depicted at the height of drama, the moment of her death. These paintings, full of vibrant detail and theatrical tension, immortalized her as a queen confronting fate. But it's worth noting what they leave out. We seldom see Cleopatra ruling, debating, or commanding armies. Instead, we see her adorned in gold, draped in silks, her body poised as though she's already given into the myth. The imagery is iconic, yes, but it feeds directly into the same Roman-fueled legacy of Cleopatra as spectacle over substance. By the modern era, Cleopatra evolved again, this time through film and pop culture, from Claudette Colbert's elaborate depiction in 1934's Cleopatra to Elizabeth Taylor's unforgettable portrayal in 1963's blockbuster of the same name. Hollywood took Cleopatra's story and turned it into a feast for the eyes. The glittering palaces, the dazzling costumes, the star-crossed romance, it's all there, except for the parts that complicate the fairy tale. Cleopatra became less of a ruler and more of a Hollywood legend, remembered as the queen who smuggled herself to meet Caesar in a rug and dazzled Antony into ruin. These films leaned into the idea of Cleopatra as impossibly glamorous, her brains overshadowed by her beauty. And while they added to her cultural mystique, they didn't recover the image of the strategist or the protector of Egypt. Yet there has always been a thread of resistance, a counter-narrative trying to reclaim who Cleopatra really was. Modern historians have worked to peel back the layers of Roman bias, piecing together a more nuanced story. They've highlighted her intelligence, her political acumen, and her role as a leader fighting to maintain Egypt's independence in the face of overwhelming imperialism. Cleopatra wasn't just reacting to the whims of Caesar or Antony. She was building a path for her kingdom, however narrow that path may have been. Scholars argue that relegating her legacy to romance does her a profound disservice. Her relationships with powerful Romans weren't about passion alone. They were survival strategies. calculated plays in a game where the odds were never in her favor. What's more, Cleopatra's story continues to inspire debates not just about power, but about gender and resistance. In a world where leadership is still heavily scrutinized along gender lines, her life raises uncomfortable questions about how female leaders are judged. If Cleopatra had been a man doing exactly the same things, building alliances, defending her nation, executing rivals, would history have interpreted her actions differently? Would she have been remembered as a brilliant ruler instead of a sly seductress? These questions resonate today, making her story feel urgent even after centuries have passed. And then there's the question of survival. Cleopatra's life is an unrelenting example of what survival looks like when the odds are against you. She wielded every tool available to her: beauty, wit, wealth, and charisma, because she had no choice. Her story isn't about indulgence or recklessness. It's about a woman navigating forces far beyond her control, holding together a crumbling kingdom in a world that refused to let her thrive. Hers was a life balanced on a knife's edge, where survival came at great personal cost. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest act of defiance wasn't just in how she lived, but in how she refused to let her enemies dictate her final chapter. Rome erased a lot of who she was, but not all of it. Her intellect, her boldness, her indomitable spirit, they shone through the rubble of her fall, enough to haunt the Western imagination for centuries. Her quiet tragedy lingers. A queen who had to fight every step of the way, and who, in death, became larger than life. Cleopatra's true legacy isn't found in the gold she wore, the men she loved, or even the empire she ruled. It's in the defiance that still speaks to us all these years later. She may have lost her kingdom, but her story, that will never belong to Rome. Cleopatra's life wasn't built for quiet victories. It was a balancing act over a pit she knew would eventually swallow her, and every step she took came at a cost. She fought with everything she had: her mind, her alliances, and finally, her very life. But in the end, survival demanded sacrifices she could never take back. It's a story that makes you wonder, how much of yourself can you lose and still call it survival? Maybe that's the real question Cleopatra leaves behind. Let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed this, join me next time for another timeless story.